The first thing Nadia noticed about the Harborview Club wasn't the chandeliers or the imported marble or the kind of quiet that money buys. It was the way the men inside it moved. Slow, deliberate, like they'd never once been told to hurry up in their lives. She'd been playing piano there for 11 days. 11 days of arriving through the service entrance on Burrard Street. 11 days of nodding to the same security guard who never once asked her name. 11 days of sitting down at the Steinway in the corner of the main lounge and disappearing into the background the way good musicians learn to do when the room isn't really listening. The Harborview was a private members' club, the kind that didn't advertise, didn't have a website worth finding, and didn't need either. Its membership list was a carefully guarded secret. Though anyone who paid attention could piece it together from the cars out front, the names dropped in passing, the way the staff moved around certain tables like they were orbiting small suns. Nadia Sheridan had not applied for this job. It had come to her through her professor at the Vancouver Academy of Music, who had a friend who knew the club's events coordinator, who needed a pianist on short notice after the previous one had quit without explanation. Nadia was 26, 2 years into her graduate performance program, and her scholarship covered tuition, but not rent. She had said yes before she'd finished reading the email. The pay was extraordinary. She told herself that's all it was. The man they called Mr. Harwick arrived on her third day, and the entire room shifted when he walked in. Not loudly, there was no announcement, no obvious deference. It was subtler than that. Conversations paused for a half-second, backs straightened. The head bartender, a composed man named Gill who Nadia had come to respect for his steadiness, moved a bottle of scotch from the second shelf to the first, without being asked. Nadia kept playing, a Chopin nocturne. She was in the middle of the development section, the part where the melody climbs and turns restless, and she let it carry her through the next few minutes without looking up. She heard his voice before she saw his face. Someone turn that down. She didn't turn that down. She wasn't a volume knob. She was a person. But she finished the phrase cleanly, let the final chord decay, and moved her hands to her lap. The room had gone quieter than the music, which told her everything she needed to know. Harwick. His full name was Conrad Harwick. She'd learned from Gill, who'd said it in the same tone people use when they warn you about black ice, was somewhere in his mid-50s. Broad-shouldered in the way of men who'd been athletic once and let the muscle settle into something denser. He wore a charcoal suit that had been made for him specifically, and he walked to his usual table in the far corner with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never, not once, considered that he might be in anyone's way. He glanced at her across the room, not at her exactly, through her. The way you look at furniture. Something quieter, he said to no one in particular, or to everyone. It amounted to the same thing. Nadia looked back at the keys and chose a Satai gymnopédie. Slower, more space between the notes. She wasn't angry, she was cataloguing. This was a skill she'd developed early. The ability to observe without letting observation become emotion. Her mother had called it reading the room. Her coach, back in another life entirely, had called it threat assessment. She played Sati, and she watched Conrad Harwick order without looking at the menu, interrupt a man mid-sentence to take a phone call, and send back a glass of wine that appeared to Nadia to be perfectly good wine. 11 days passed like that. She played, he arrived, the room adjusted itself around him. She did not. On the 12th day, he spoke to her directly for the first time. She was packing up at the end of the evening, tucking her music into her bag when she became aware that he was standing behind her. Not close, he wasn't the type to crowd, but close enough that she registered the weight of him in the room before she turned around. You made an error, he said. Second set, the Ravel. Nadia zipped her bag. I don't believe I did. I've heard that piece performed at Carnegie Hall. Then you know how it goes. She looked at him. Good evening, Mr. Harwick. She picked up her bag and walked to the service exit. She heard Gill exhale sharply behind her. She heard the particular silence that follows when someone does something no one does in this room. She pushed through the door and stepped out into the October air, and felt the cold hit her face like a correction. That was a mistake, some part of her said. The smarter part said, no, it wasn't. She found out the next morning that her contract had been reviewed. The events coordinator, a nervous woman named Miss Frey, called to say there'd been some feed from members, and that Nadia's engagement style might not be the right fit for the club's atmosphere. Nadia thanked her and hung up. She sat for a moment at the kitchen table of her apartment in Mount Pleasant, a small place, 3rd floor, one window that faced a brick wall and another that faced a sliver of sky. And she looked at her hands resting on the table and thought about money and rent, and the gap between what she earned and what she owed. Then she thought about what he'd said. You made an error. She thought about that for a long time. The Vancouver Underground Circuit wasn't advertised in any program or listed on any website. It existed in the margins. A number passed between people who trusted each other. A location texted the morning of, a door in the back of a building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Nadia had first heard about it 3 years ago from a classmate, a cellist named Drew, who moonlighted as a competitive submission grappler and had the kind of casual confidence that comes from knowing you can handle yourself anywhere. Drew had mentioned it once, in passing, and Nadia had filed it away without comment. She'd been competing quietly for 18 months. She hadn't told anyone at the academy. It wasn't relevant to her degree, and she had learned, a long time ago, that people who knew 2 things about you often tried to make those 2 things into a contradiction. The music and the fighting were not a contradiction. They lived in the same part of her, the part that required precision, timing, the management of breath under pressure. The part that understood that discipline without passion is just routine, and passion without discipline is just noise. Her record in the circuit was 11 wins and 1 loss, the loss coming in her 4th bout when she'd been overconfident and paid for it with a bruised rib and a lesson she'd only needed to learn once. The style she fought in was Muay Thai, with a ground game that Drew had spent 2 years teaching her. She was not the biggest fighter in the room. She rarely was. What she was patient, technically sound, difficult to read. Nobody at the Harborview Club knew any of this. She went back to teaching private lessons. A handful of kids in the evenings, a retired accountant who wanted to learn Bach, and she picked up weekend shifts at a bar in Gastown that had live music on Fridays. She didn't think about Conrad Harwick again for 6 weeks. Then she ran into Gil at a grocery store in Kitsilano. He was buying coffee and looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, the way people do when you're used to seeing them in uniform. He spotted her first, then looked away, then looked back, and she could see him deciding something. He asked about you, Gil said. He said it quietly. The way you deliver information you're not sure the other person wants. Nadia set a bag of rice in her basket. Did it twice, once the week you left and once last month. Gil was quiet for a moment. I've worked there 9 years. I've never seen him ask about staff. She wasn't sure what to do with that information, so she put it where she put most things she wasn't ready to use, away, but accessible. How is the Ravel holding up? She asked. Gil smiled despite himself. They hired someone who plays it exactly right. It's very boring. She laughed. It surprised her. The call came on a Wednesday. Miss Frey from the club, with the careful voice of someone reading from a script someone else had written. Would Nadia be available to return? There had been a reconsideration. The terms would be the same. Nadia considered the kitchen wall. She considered her bank balance, which had been rebuilt to a state that could charitably be described as functional. She considered the month of November outside her window, doing what November in Vancouver does. Grey and damp and settling in for the long haul. The terms won't be the same, Nadia said. They'll be 15% higher. A pause. The sound of Miss Frey recalibrating. I'll need to check. Of course. Let me know. They called back within the hour. The answer was yes. She showed up the following Thursday evening, went through the service entrance, nodded to the security guard, and sat down at the Steinway. She opened with a Debussy prelude, La Cathédrale Engloutie, the sunken cathedral, which filled the room with the particular quality of sound that makes people stop talking and listen, whether they mean to or not. Harwick arrived at 9:15. She felt the room shift the way it always did. She did not change what she was playing. He didn't say anything that night. He sat at his table, conducted his business, and left at 11. As he passed the piano on his way out, he paused. She kept playing. "Debussy," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. "Correct," she said. She didn't look up. She heard something that might have been a sound of amusement, and then the door. It went on like this for another 2 weeks. She played, he arrived. Sometimes he said something. Sometimes he didn't. She responded when she chose to, and returned to the music when she didn't. The other staff watched this dynamic with a kind of fascinated horror. On a Thursday in late November, Harwick came in earlier than usual. There were fewer members that evening. Some event elsewhere in the city had drawn people out, and the room was quieter than normal, which meant that when he spoke from across the room, she heard him clearly. "Play something with some life in it," he said. "This sounds like a waiting room." Nadia finished the phrase she was in, set her hands in her lap, turned on the bench to face him. "With respect, Mr. Harwick," she said, with zero respect in her voice, "a waiting room plays recorded music at a volume chosen to be inoffensive. What I'm playing is a Ravel sonatine that requires considerably more skill than anything you've heard in a waiting room. If the distinction is lost on you, I'd suggest the problem isn't the music." The room went very still. It was the kind of still that has weight to it, the kind that other people remember years later and describe in terms of temperature. "It got cold in there," they'd say. I don't know how else to put it. Harwick looked at her. He had grey eyes. She noticed that now, for the first time, which was strange because she'd been looking at him for weeks. Or maybe she'd been careful not to, and he'd given her a reason. "You have a lot of nerve," he said. "I have a lot of skill," she said. "Which is what you're paying for." She turned back to the piano. She didn't hear him move, which was impressive for a man his size. She only became aware that he had crossed the room when his shadow fell over the keys from behind her. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. She placed her hands and began to play again. Something different. Prokofiev, sharp-edged, percussive, the kind of thing that takes up space. "You're a member of this club," she said, "which means you're accustomed to being agreed with. Good evening, Mr. Harwick." He stood there for a long moment. She could feel him deciding something. "Tomorrow night," he said. 8 o'clock, the back room. She turned her head slightly, not enough to look at him. "I'm not available for private engagements." "Not to play," he said. There was something different in his voice now. Not anger, something with more texture than that. "I want to see what else you can do." She turned then, fully, and looked at him. "What does that mean?" she asked. "One of my associates saw you last month, at a venue in East Vancouver." His voice was even. "He said you were remarkable." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 5. Long enough for him to understand she wasn't flustered. "He must be confused," she said. "Mitchell doesn't confuse easily." The ghost of something moved across his face. 8 o'clock. If you're not there, we don't speak of it again." "If you are," he paused. "I'd like to understand what I'm looking at." He walked back to his table without waiting for her answer. She played Prokofiev until the end of her set. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing about training for long enough. The body learns to hold still even when everything inside it is moving. She told herself she wasn't going. She told herself this at midnight when she couldn't sleep. She told herself this in the morning, when she ran the seawall and watched the freighters sitting heavy in English Bay. She told herself this at 6 o'clock, when she changed out of her running clothes and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her phone. She told herself this at 7:40, when she put on dark jeans, a grey Henley and her hair back, and walked out the door. The harbour view had a rear annex accessed through a corridor off the main lounge. She'd been told it was used for private dinners, card games, the kind of conversations that don't happen in rooms with other people present. The door was unlocked. Inside, low lighting, a bar along one wall, 3 men Nadia didn't recognize arranged in chairs at the edges of the room, and Harwick standing in the center of a space that had been cleared of furniture. He was wearing different clothes than she'd ever seen him in. Dark trousers, a fitted shirt, no jacket. He looked like a man who had spent time in rooms like this before. Miss Sheridan, he said, so he'd learned her name, or he'd always known it. Mr. Harwick, she said. She didn't look at the other men, she looked at him. My associate described a woman with very specific abilities, he said. I'd like a demonstration. Of what exactly? He said you fought. Still, that same measured tone. I want to see if that's true. She looked at the cleared floor, at the men in the chairs, who were watching her with the careful attention of people who were expecting to be entertained. Something turned over slowly in her chest. Not fear. She'd made her peace with fear a long time ago, broken it down and rebuilt it as fuel. This was something else. Something colder. You'd like me to perform, she said. For your friends. I'd like to know if the skill is real, Harwick said. He took a step toward her. There's a difference. There's a man standing in the corner who looks like he's been in a ring before, she said. Is that a coincidence? One of the three men, the one on the right heavyset, with the kind of neck that suggested dedicated gym time, shifted in his chair. That's Renner, Harwick said. He's trained. I'm sure he is, Nadia said. She put her bag down by the door. She pulled her sleeves up to the elbows. She looked at Renner, who stood up and rolled his shoulders and smiled in the way that men who are confident they're stronger than you smile just before they learn something about themselves. Rules? She asked. First to yield, Harwick said. Fine. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not what anyone in that room expected. She knew this not because she tracked their reactions. She had no attention to spare, but because of the quality of the silence. It was different from the silence in the main lounge. That silence was social, performed, the kind that exists to communicate something to the people around it. This silence was involuntary. This was the silence that follows something you weren't prepared for. Renner was strong and he was trained, and he was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a given space. His first combination was solid, controlled, measured, clearly designed to test her rather than end it quickly. She slipped the jab, let the cross go past her ear, and answered with a teep to his midsection that stopped him cold. He reset. She waited. The second exchange was harder. He adjusted faster than she'd expected. That was genuine skill, and she logged it without softening her assessment of what she needed to do next. When he reached for a clinch, she turned inside his arm, put her weight on her back leg, and drove an elbow into his shoulder that made him grunt and step back. The third exchange ended it. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of impact that makes a sound the room remembers. Just a very precise leg kick to the outside of his knee that buckled him, and when he stumbled, she stepped away and let him fall without following him down. Renner sat on the floor for a moment. Then he put his hand up. Nadia stepped back. She wasn't breathing hard. That wasn't bravado, it was pacing. She'd stayed in a gear she could maintain. She looked at Harwick. He hadn't moved, he was watching her with those grey eyes, and there was nothing performing in his expression now. Just attention. The pure, unfiltered kind. You're not what I expected, he said. People rarely are, she said. She picked her bag up off the floor. I'd like to talk, he said. I have an early lesson. She put her strap over her shoulder. Good night, Mr. Harwick, Miss Sheridan. She paused at the door. You're wasted on the piano room, he said. She looked back at him over her shoulder. I'm not wasted anywhere, she said. That's kind of the point. She let herself out. The corridor was cool and quiet, and she walked back through the main lounge without looking at anyone, and out through the service entrance onto Burrard Street, where the rain had started again, the way it does in Vancouver in November, persistent and indifferent to whatever's happening inside. She stood in it for a moment. Let it hit her face. There was a particular feeling she'd learned to recognize. The moment after something shifts, when you can feel the new configuration settling, but you can't yet see its shape. She'd felt it after her first win in the circuit, after her first performance at a real concert hall, after certain conversations that turn out to be more important than they looked. She felt it now. She started walking toward the bus stop, hands in her pockets, rain in her hair, and somewhere behind her the Harborview Club sat in its quiet light and went on being exactly what it was, a place that managed carefully from the outside to look like nothing had just changed. She did not hear from Harwick for 9 days. On the 10th day, a letter arrived at her apartment. Paper, not email, heavy cream stock. Her name and address written in handwriting that belonged to a person who'd been taught penmanship as a child and had not forgotten it. There was no return address. Inside, a single card. I'd like to discuss a proposal. Dinner, Saturday, your choice of restaurant. She turned it over, looked at the back, which was blank. She thought about the 9 days of silence, which she recognized as deliberate. The move of a man who understands that waiting is a form of leverage, and who was accustomed to being waited on rather than waiting. She thought about the letter, which was not an email, which was a choice. The weight of the paper, the handwriting. She thought about Renner on the floor, and the way Harwick had watched her afterward, and what he meant by proposal. She got out her phone. Looked up a restaurant in Yellowtown she'd been meaning to try. A quiet place, good reputation, booths in the back, the kind of place where a conversation could be private without being hidden. She texted Miss Frey, who she suspected was also functioning as Harwick's informal communications relay. Saturday works, 7 p.m., folio, on Hamilton. The reply came in 4 minutes. Confirmed. Thank you, Miss Sheridan. She set her phone down on the table. The rain had stopped. Outside her window, the sliver of sky between the buildings was the particular dark blue of a Vancouver late afternoon in November, not quite night but finished pretending to be day. She went to the piano in the corner of her living room. A modest upright, the first thing she'd bought when she moved in, the last thing she'd ever sell, and she sat down and played for an hour. Nothing with a name, something that found its own shape as she went. Her hands moved and the room held the sound, and she thought about all the things that looked like one thing and were another. She thought about the Harborview Club and its careful quiet, and the way a room full of powerful men had gone still for a woman in dark jeans and a grey Henley who had just put their colleague on the floor without raising her voice. She thought about Saturday. She kept playing. The story wasn't finished, she knew. It was barely started. And that, if she was honest with herself, more honest than she usually allowed, was exactly what frightened her, and also exactly what made her want to stay in it. She'd find out Saturday what he intended to propose, but she already knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever it was, she would not be accepting his terms. She'd be offering her own.